January 3rd, 2 a.m. at night. The target was confirmed. Nicolás Maduro was sleeping in his luxury bedroom.
A massive rocket blast shook the mansion to its core.
Panicked, he ran toward his secret tunnel, thinking he would escape.
But he didn't know that the US Army had already reached the other end of the tunnel.
What happened that night? Let's find out. But the real question is, why did the US take such a massive risk for a seemingly simple capture mission? Why was the world's biggest superpower obsessed with this South American nation called Venezuela?
The story begins with oil. Venezuela holds the largest oil reserves in the world, even more than Saudi Arabia. But in the last 20 years, Venezuela didn't become America's friend. It became its biggest enemy.
When Nicolás Maduro came to power, he strengthened ties not with the US, but with Russia, China, and Iran. An enemy stronghold forming in America's backyard was something Washington could not tolerate.
And it wasn't just about oil. The US accused Maduro of narco-terrorism. They claimed he was running the Cartel de los Soles and funneling drugs into America.
So the US imposed heavy sanctions on Venezuela. For years, their economy was strangled, assets were frozen, hoping Maduro would be forced to surrender. But the sanctions failed. Maduro stayed in power.
America and the world hoped that change would come through the ballot. In July 2024, Venezuela held presidential elections. The public voted in massive numbers, demanding change. Every exit poll and every independent data source screamed that the opposition leader, Edmundo Gonzalez, had won by a huge margin. But overnight, the script was flipped. Maduro-controlled election commission declared him the winner again, without presenting any detailed evidence. This wasn't just election fraud. It was the open murder of democracy.
When millions of people demanded their rights on the streets, they were silenced with guns and tanks.
That was the trigger point. Washington realized that the era of sanctions and election drama was over.
In late 2025, America deployed its most powerful aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, to the Caribbean Sea. The time for talk was over. It was now time for action.
It was 2 a.m. in Washington, D.C., when a final order was signed inside the Situation Room. The mission code name was Operation Absolute Resolve. The target was clear: capture Nicolás Maduro, dead or alive. But Venezuela's air defense system consisted of Russian-made S-300 units capable of detecting and destroying any fighter jet.
That's why the attack didn't begin with bullets. It began with code. Exactly 10 minutes before the strike, US Cyber Command hacked into Venezuela's military radar network.
Control rooms in Caracas fell into darkness. They assumed it was just a power outage, but it wasn't. It was death knocking at their door.
Taking advantage of the blackout, stealth Black Hawk helicopters approached Venezuelan airspace from above the Caribbean Sea. On board were the most dangerous commandos in the world, DevGru, SEAL Team 6. They were flying just 10 feet above the waves to avoid detection by any remaining radar. The target location was confirmed: a secret mansion inside Fort Tiuna military base. Satellite images showed heavy rooftop security.
Commanders knew that landing directly would trigger heavy firefights, so the plan changed. First shock, then awe.
Above the mansion, hidden inside the clouds, an MQ-9 Reaper drone had already locked on to its prey. Time synced, and the pilot pressed the button.
A Hellfire missile cut through the air, heading straight toward Maduro's safe house.
On the ground, no one had any idea that in the next 5 seconds, everything would end. And then, boom! The blast was so powerful that the entire mansion shook. But US intelligence was correct. Maduro was not in that room. Just seconds before the explosion, he had already sprinted toward the panic room. Amid smoke, fire, and screams, Maduro and his guards rushed toward a secret tunnel that would lead them out of the city. The tunnel was 2 kilometers long and opened straight into a private airstrip. Maduro believed he had escaped America's grasp. He thought the drone strike was just a distraction, but he was wrong. Very wrong. As soon as they reached the other end of the tunnel, there was silence in the darkness. Suddenly, click! Thousands of lumens of flashlight beams struck their faces. It wasn't a rescue team in front of them. It was operators from SEAL Team 6. They were given no chance to resist. A single flashbang, and everything turned white. Within seconds, the most powerful man in Venezuela was on his knees, hands cuffed, and a black hood over his head. Mission time, total 18 minutes. Before the Venezuelan army could even react, US helicopters were already in the air, carrying their high-value target. By dawn, Nicolás Maduro was not in Caracas. He was locked inside a cell on a US warship. Operation Absolute Resolve was a success, but military experts across the world were stunned. The question wasn't that the US captured Maduro. The question was how America managed to deploy such a massive force at Venezuela's doorstep so easily, even with Russia and China in the picture. This did not happen overnight. Behind this 18-minute mission was decades-old Cold War planning, something we had all ignored.
To attack Venezuela, America needed a launchpad, a place close to Venezuela, but still US territory. And that place was Puerto Rico.
History is witness. Whenever America wants to show power in Latin America, it opens its old playbooks. This time was no different. The Pentagon dusted off one of its oldest and most trusted assets, the Roosevelt Roads Naval Station.
This base was built during the Cold War, but it was shut down in 2004. However, intelligence reports indicate that in the past few years, sudden activity had increased here.
Runways that had been covered with grass were cleared overnight. Hangars that had turned into ruins now had lines of F-35s and logistics aircraft.
But why Roosevelt Roads? Because the distance from here to Caracas is only about 500 miles, 800 kilometers. For a fighter jet, that is just a 30-minute route.
America quietly converted this base into a forward operating base. The goal was clear. If Russia sent its ships to Venezuela, the US needed to already be positioned there to stop them.
Not just jets. The base stored such massive quantities of fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies that it looked ready for a full-scale war.
Maduro thought the US was only threatening, but he failed to see that across the sea, the battlefield had already been fully prepared.
While America was laying its network in the Caribbean, Nicolás Maduro was not sitting idle. He knew fighting the United States alone was impossible, so he did what every dictator does. He asked for help from the other side of the world, and help arrived in the form of Russia's muscle and China's money.
The first entry was Russia. Over the past decade, Vladimir Putin had turned Venezuela into his South American fortress. To protect Maduro, Russia sent its most advanced S-300 air defense systems. It was claimed that these systems could turn any American jet into ashes. Not just that. According to reports, Wagner Group mercenaries, the same private army that wreaked havoc in Ukraine and Africa, had secretly become Maduro's personal bodyguards. On the other side stood China. If Russia brought the guns, China brought the wallet. China gave Venezuela billions of dollars in loans, but not in the name of friendship, in the name of oil. Maduro had sold the country's future. More than half of Venezuela's crude oil was now going straight to Beijing the moment it was extracted.
China also installed surveillance cameras and facial recognition technology there so that Maduro could keep watch over his people 24/7.
For America, this was no longer just a Venezuela issue. It had become a Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0. Washington feared that if action wasn't taken today, then tomorrow Russia could park its nuclear bombers in Caracas.
Maduro believed that Russian missiles and Chinese money would become his invincible shield.
But he forgot. Wars are not won by weapons alone. A functioning economy is needed to run a country. And from the inside, Venezuela had already become hollow.
On one side, there were Russian missiles, and on the other side, people were dying of hunger. That weakness was exactly where America made its next move.
There are very few countries in the world that possess the most oil on Earth, yet whose people struggle just to get petrol. Venezuela's story is this exact paradox.
There was a time when Venezuela was the richest country in South America. PDVSA, the state oil company, was printing money. But mismanagement and corruption clipped the wings of this golden goose, and whatever remained was squeezed out by U.S. sanctions.
When the U.S. saw that Maduro wasn't willing to give up power, they launched economic warfare. Washington imposed restrictions on Venezuelan oil and cut the country off from the global banking system.
Result? Venezuela's economy went into free fall. Inflation rose so high that people needed bags of currency notes just to buy a loaf of bread. The government didn't even have enough money to pay salaries to soldiers and generals.
When money stopped coming through legal channels, the Maduro regime chose a darker route. If oil couldn't be sold, cocaine would be.
According to U.S. intelligence, Venezuela's military, meant to defend the country, had turned into a drug cartel. This group was named Cartel de los Soles, Cartel of the Suns.
This was no ordinary gang. It was the only cartel in the world run by uniformed generals.
Drugs would arrive from neighboring Colombia into Venezuela, and from there they would be flown or shipped to the US and Europe using military aircraft and vessels.
The money that oil no longer brought was now coming from white powder. This black money kept Maduro's throne intact. But there was still a problem. So much illegal cash couldn't be hidden using banks because the US monitored every transaction.
Maduro needed a new invisible vault, and that's when a new technology entered the picture, one that punched a hole through sanctions: cryptocurrency. When the US froze Venezuela's bank accounts, they thought the game was over, but Maduro still had an ace card left, a currency controlled by no American, no bank, and no government: Bitcoin.
Venezuela may not have had money for food, but it had something else: almost free electricity. The regime exploited this and converted old factories into massive crypto mining farms. Machines ran day and night, generating dollars from the digital world.
The shock came when Venezuela launched the world's first state-owned cryptocurrency, called the Petro. Maduro claimed it would be backed by their oil reserves. The objective was simple: bypass the US dollar and trade directly in international markets.
Although the Petro turned out to be a major scam and eventually failed, it still showed the regime a new pathway.
Even though Petro sank, USDT and Tether and Bitcoin kept Maduro breathing. According to reports, Venezuela made payments to Iran and Turkey for imports, whether weapons or food, quietly through crypto wallets.
The swift banking system just watched, while millions of dollars crossed borders through blockchain.
This is why, despite such severe sanctions, the Maduro regime never collapsed.
America realized that financial warfare would no longer work. You can block bank accounts, but not digital wallets. If Maduro had to be stopped, it would have to be done in the physical world, not the virtual one.
They needed to block the routes through which these ships were entering Venezuela.
And so, the Pentagon made its biggest move. Computer screens were shut off, and warship engines were fired up. It was time for the largest naval blockade in modern history.
When blocking digital routes became difficult, the US decided it was time to show physical force. The Pentagon activated the US Fourth Fleet.
Overnight, the Caribbean Sea, once famous for tourists and cruise ships, transformed into a war zone. The strategy was called the Iron Ring.
Officially, the world was told that this was a counter-narcotics operation, a mission to stop drugs, but the reality was very different.
This was a naval blockade of Venezuela. American warships completely surrounded Venezuela's coastline. The objective was clear. Nothing goes in, nothing comes out.
Every inch of the sea was within US radar coverage. Any ship, whether carrying oil from Iran or containers from China, if it moved towards Venezuela, it would be intercepted by a US destroyer.
Boarding parties were sent to inspect every vessel. If there was even a hint of suspicion, the ship was turned back. For the Maduro regime, which depended on foreign imports, survival became difficult. The impact of the blockade was immediate. Venezuelan ports became deserted. Gasoline shortages already existed. Now they became absolute.
Maduro's generals had money in crypto, but there was no way to bring purchased goods into the country. The sea was no longer their friend. It had become their jailer.
But this blockade wasn't only about cutting supply lines. Those ships weren't standing there just as watchmen. Inside them were hundreds of Tomahawk cruise missiles. They were positioned there so that when the order came, the kill chain could begin. In the military world, there is a term called the kill chain. It means finding the enemy, locking onto them, and eliminating them the moment the order is given. The US Navy standing in the Caribbean wasn't just forming a blockade, it had already activated this kill chain.
The Arleigh Burke-class destroyers floating quietly on the sea looked calm from the outside, but the atmosphere inside was anything but peaceful.
These ships possessed the most advanced radar system in the world, the Aegis combat system. It could track more than 100 targets simultaneously. Whether a Venezuelan fighter jet took off or a missile was launched, Aegis would detect it in the blink of an eye. But the biggest threat wasn't in the air. It was hidden beneath the decks of the ships.
Each destroyer carried dozens of Tomahawk cruise missiles. These are the same missiles capable of striking through a single window from over 1,000 miles away.
The Pentagon's list was ready. Maduro's palace, military bunkers, air bases, and communication towers. Every target already had a digital X marked on it.
The generals sitting in Caracas knew they were at gunpoint. Their radars were being jammed. They didn't even know from which direction a missile would come.
Just one command, just one go signal, and the entire Venezuelan military infrastructure would turn to dust. But missiles were only the beginning. Real fear emerged when, on the horizon, a ship as large as a mountain appeared. This wasn't an ordinary warship. This was a floating fortress, carrying thousands of Marines in its belly.
The ship that appeared on the horizon wasn't a regular Navy vessel. It was an amphibious assault ship. The world calls it a baby carrier, but for Venezuela, it was a harbinger of doom.
Because this ship wasn't built just for fighting in the air, it was built to seize land. It didn't carry missiles, it carried a full force of US Marines.
The rear section of the ship slowly opened and seawater began filling in. From inside emerged LCACs, giant hovercrafts.
These machines can carry a 60-ton tank on their backs, glide over water, and land directly on the beach. Maduro's army had coastal defenses set up, but they knew that once these monsters arrived, stopping them would be impossible.
But the threat wasn't just coming from the sea. From the ship's deck, MV-22 Ospreys lifted off, aircraft that take off like helicopters but dash forward like planes.
Their job wasn't to fight on the beach. Their job was to land behind enemy lines and flank them. This is called vertical envelopment.
The situation was clear. Tanks were coming from the front, and Marines were dropping from the rear.
The generals in Caracas understood this wasn't just an airstrike. This was an invasion. America wasn't here to intimidate them. It was here to plant its flag on their soil.
To land troops on the ground, the route had to be cleared first. And to clear that route, the skies had to be controlled.
Just moments before the Marines landed, a sound cut through the clouds that froze everything. Sonic booms. The real game of the US Air Force was about to begin.
Before an invasion, there's one golden rule: clear the skies. If you don't own the sky, your defeat on the ground is certain. First to enter was the Ghost, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. On radar, this aircraft appears smaller than a bird, but in its belly, it carries 40,000 pounds of explosives.
Maduro's remaining S-300 air defense systems that were still active, the B-2 picked them off one by one and silenced them. Sirens were blaring across the air bases in Caracas. Pilots scrambled toward their jets. But it was already too late. F-22 Raptors, already loitering in the air, blew the Venezuelan jets apart right on the runway. This is what you call a spawn kill. Don't even give the enemy a chance to take off. Even the one or two jets that managed to get airborne were shot down by F-22s from 50 kilometers away. The Venezuelan pilots didn't even realize who or what had hit them.
But the real game changer was the F-35 Lightning II. It isn't just a fighter jet, it's the quarterback of the skies. While airborne, it linked drones, ships, and ground troops into a single unified network. A drone spotted an enemy tank. The F-35 processed the data, and a destroyer stationed out at sea launched a missile. Everything happened within a matter of seconds.
Just 4 hours. Yes, it took only 4 hours for America to gain complete control over Venezuelan airspace. Now there wasn't a single Venezuelan jet in the sky, and not a single radar remained active. The sky wasn't blue anymore, it was gray, the color of the US Air Force.
Once the skies were clear, it was time for those who operate in the shadows. Everyone saw the massive strikes, but the real mission was the one that remained invisible to all. Now it was time for the ghosts to hit the ground.
Wars are fought in two ways. One, the kind you see on CNN and BBC, massive explosions and fighter jets. And the other, the kind that never makes the news. While the US Air Force was raining fire from the sky, the ghosts had already touched down on the ground. These were the US Tier 1 operators, Delta Force and Navy SEALs. Their mission wasn't to fight. Their mission was to leave the enemy blind and deaf. A sudden blast rocked the main power grid in Caracas, plunging the entire city into darkness. Military fiber optic cables were severed. Generals reached for their phones to issue orders to their troops,
but the lines were dead. This wasn't a technical glitch. This was Special Forces sabotage. But the deepest game of all was played by the Green Berets. Their motto is De oppresso liber, to free the oppressed. They embedded themselves directly with the Venezuelan resistance. Those who hated Maduro were provided with weapons and intelligence. Now Maduro's soldiers weren't just afraid of the Americans. They began to fear their own people. Every street, every window had become an enemy. Logistics lines were severed. Bridges were blown up. Maduro's tank battalions tried to advance, but the way was blocked. Without firing a single bullet, U.S. Special Forces threw massive armies into a state of paralysis. The stage was set. The enemy had been weakened. But an army cannot fight unless its stomach is full and there are bullets in its guns. The Special Forces had cleared the way, but now it was time for the thing that truly wins wars. Not bombs, not bullets, but logistics. Napoleon once said, "An army marches on its stomach." But in modern warfare, an army runs on fuel and ammunition. Logistics might sound boring, but the truth is, if the supply line stops, the world's most advanced F-35 jet becomes nothing more than an expensive paperweight. America unleashed an iron river toward Venezuela. The first thing needed was fuel. To reach Venezuela, the jets would get thirsty while still in the air. KC-135 Stratotankers were circling the skies. These are essentially flying petrol pumps. Thousands of feet up, at speeds of 500 miles an hour, a pipe connects and the jet's tank is filled. If it weren't for these tankers, the U.S. Air Force wouldn't have even been able to reach the Venezuelan border. Then came the heavy machinery. Sending tanks by sea was too slow, so America called in its monsters, the C-5 Galaxy and the C-17 Globemaster. These planes are so massive that an entire train could fit inside them. Every hour, yes, every single hour, a C-17 was touching down. Tanks, artillery, missiles. Maduro watched as a mountain of iron continued to rise right on his border. Logistics doesn't just mean delivering supplies, it means building cities. Within just 24 hours, entire mini-cities were erected on Puerto Rico and the surrounding islands. Field hospitals, kitchens, ammo depots. Even the Russian advisors were stunned by the speed of the US military, because before the fighting had even truly begun, America had already won the resource war.
The land and the skies were saturated, but one place still appeared empty, the depths of the ocean. There was no noise there, only silence. But that silence was the most dangerous of all, because down there, the wolves were prowling.
While the massive ships of the US Navy were making noise on the surface to act as a distraction, the real threat lay where even sunlight couldn't reach. The Virginia-class attack submarines. They're called silent assassins. They run on nuclear power, yet they make less noise than a library. Exactly when they entered Venezuelan waters remains a mystery. No radar or satellite could detect them.
A different kind of war was being fought here, a game of cat and mouse. Intelligence reports suggested that Russia had dispatched some of its Akula-class submarines to protect Venezuela. But the technology gap of the US subs was so vast that the Russian crews had no idea they were being shadowed. A Virginia-class submarine can sit silently beneath the enemy for weeks, recording every movement, every single sound. They didn't just carry torpedoes. The vertical tubes of these submarines were loaded with cruise missiles. Maduro expected the attack to come from the sky, but these subs could launch hundreds of missiles from beneath the water without ever surfacing.
The enemy would only realize it when the missiles were already raining down upon their heads. But even bigger than the missiles was the task of espionage. Stretched across the ocean floor are undersea internet cables, the lifelines of the entire country's communication. The US submarines quietly tapped into these cables. Now, every Venezuelan email, every phone call, every military order was reaching the Pentagon first and the generals second. The enemy was already blind. Now they were about to be turned mute as well. The physical wires had been tapped. Now it was time to intercept the waves floating through the air. The next strike wouldn't come from a bomb, but from invisible waves. An attack that cannot be seen, yet brings everything to a standstill. In war, the greatest fear isn't death, it's confusion. Imagine a pilot flying at 2,000 kilometers per hour and suddenly his radar goes dead. His GPS vanishes, and all he hears on his radio is a piercing screech. This is what we call electronic warfare. And for this, America sent its most unusual weapon, the EA-18G Growler. This plane doesn't fire missiles, it fires radio waves. As soon as the Growlers entered Venezuelan airspace, they flooded the entire electromagnetic spectrum. Maduro's S-300 missile system radars suddenly saw 1,000 jets in the sky, when in reality, there was only one. The missile batteries were paralyzed with confusion. Who do they fire at? The real target had vanished behind a wall of electronic noise.
It wasn't just the radars. The very backbone of their communication was shattered. Generals were shouting orders to their commanders, but there was no one on the other end to hear them. The frequency jamming was so powerful that walkie-talkies turned into useless pieces of plastic. Drones that were once patrolling the skies lost their links and fell to the earth like stones. The entire Venezuelan defense system was completely paralyzed.
This is the fog of war. The enemy has no idea where the attack is coming from, how many are coming, or where to run for cover. Maduro's army was flailing like a blind man in the dark. They still had their hardware, the machines, but they were useless. They possessed the weapons, but they had lost the power to use them.
Electronic warfare had already shut their eyes and ears, but now it was time to seize control of their brain. The signals were jammed. Now was the time to infiltrate their servers, an attack that was about to be launched from a keyboard.
Electronic warfare had closed their ears, but cyber warfare left their brain dead. Hackers sitting thousands of miles away in Fort Meade, Maryland, injected a zero-day exploit into Venezuela's military servers. It was a virus that had been sleeping in their system for months, only to wake up on the day of the attack. The moment the generals typed the fire command, a message flashed across their screens. Access denied.
But the biggest strike wasn't against the military. It was against the infrastructure. Hackers hijacked the SCADA systems, the controls for the nation's power plants. One click, and Venezuela's largest dam, the Guri Dam, went offline. The entire city of Caracas, hospitals, traffic lights, police stations, everything was plunged into total darkness. Without electricity, the pumps failed and the water stopped flowing. This war was no longer being fought on the borders. It was being fought inside people's homes.
And then the psychological cyber war began. At the borders, the phones of thousands of Venezuelan soldiers started ringing simultaneously. Everyone received the exact same SMS. Your leaders have fled. Don't throw your lives away. Go home. U.S. intelligence had hacked their telecom network to broadcast this mass message. The soldiers' morale shattered instantly. They believed the war was already over, even though it hadn't truly begun. It wasn't just the soldiers. Maduro's most loyal officers were also targeted. The hidden bank accounts where they had stashed millions of dollars were wiped to zero or frozen in a matter of seconds. Cyber Command digitally deleted their money, their power, and their confidence. Everything they had built was erased with a few strokes of a key. The system was dead. Technology had failed. Now Maduro had no radar, no money, and no communication. He was left with only one thing, something that cannot be controlled by a computer: the people. When the regular army failed, Maduro decided to play his most dangerous card.
When the generals fled and the radars went dark, Maduro gave the order everyone feared the most: Plan Furia Bolivariana. It meant one thing: turning every citizen of the country into a soldier. The government threw open its secret warehouses, and hundreds of thousands of AK-103 rifles were handed out on the streets. These weren't trained soldiers. This was the national militia: shopkeepers, students, laborers, people who held tools in their hands yesterday, held assault rifles today.
American tanks are kings of the open desert, but in urban warfare, even they can get trapped. Maduro's strategy was simple: drag America into a long, bloody quagmire. Every window, every rooftop, and every alleyway was turned into a death trap. If the U.S. Marines entered the city, they would have to face gunfire from every single house. This is what we call asymmetric warfare, where a weaker enemy, instead of fighting head-on, bleeds you at every turn.
This was the ultimate nightmare for U.S. forces. Who is the enemy and who is an innocent civilian? Distinguishing between the two became impossible. Maduro wanted it this way. If America attacked, there would be massive civilian casualties. His goal was to destroy America's image in the eyes of the world. This was the human shield tactic.
But the greatest victim of this people's war was the people themselves. Gang wars erupted on the streets. Looting became rampant. Those who held the guns became the new kings. In the name of saving the nation, Venezuela had set itself on fire, and those burning the most in these flames were the ones who had nothing to do with politics in the first place. When elephants fight, it is always the grass that gets trampled. Amidst the relentless gunfire echoing through the streets of Caracas, the ordinary citizens of Venezuela were left with only two choices: either stay in their homes and die of hunger or a stray bullet, or leave everything behind and run. And the people chose the second path. One of the largest mass migrations in history had begun. In the blink of an eye, a human tsunami surged toward the borders. Hundreds of thousands gathered at the edges of Colombia and Brazil. This wasn't an army. These were hungry, thirsty, and terrified families. They were called Los Caminantes, the walkers, because they were traveling hundreds of kilometers on foot, with blisters on their feet, children in their arms, and only one hope left in their eyes: the hope to stay alive. But there was no heaven waiting on the other side of the border. Managing such a massive influx of refugees was beyond the capacity of neighboring countries. The camps were overflowing. The food supplies had vanished. Diseases began to spread. Those who had survived the missiles,
were now dying from cholera and malnutrition. Right before the world's eyes, an entire nation was undergoing a total collapse. This brings the story to a haunting realization. In modern warfare, the system is so interconnected that you cannot surgically remove a leader without collapsing the entire life support of a nation. The logic of the Iron River has reached its tragic conclusion. The US built a perfect machine to win the war, but that same machine inadvertently broke the country beyond immediate repair. While hell was unfolding on the ground, a completely different story was being told on TV screens. The real war was no longer at the border. It was being fought on the screens. The battle of what to show the world and what to hide was about to begin. It is said that in war, the first casualty is the truth. Operation Absolute Resolve was being won on the ground, but another war was raging on the internet. Every smartphone had become a weapon. The Maduro regime had run out of missiles, but their bot farms were still alive. Thousands of fake accounts flooded the web with videos showing the US Army supposedly attacking hospitals.
The most dangerous weapon of all was deepfake AI. A viral video surfaced showing an American general actually surrendering. It looked so real that even major news channels started broadcasting it. Later, the truth came out. It was entirely AI generated. But by then, the world was already in a state of confusion. What is real? What is a lie? People's minds were being manipulated to ensure the streets stayed on fire.
America didn't stay silent either. EC-130J commando solo planes hijacked the state TV signals. Right where Maduro was speaking, a new voice cut through. Maduro is lying. We have come to help. The war was no longer about the land. It was about the narrative.
The ripple effects of this propaganda spread across the entire globe. Some hailed America as a hero, while others branded them an invader. This digital fire on the internet transformed a regional conflict into a full-blown global crisis. The media had ignited the spark. This war was no longer going to be confined within the borders of Venezuela. The great powers who had remained silent until now were finally about to speak. The phones had gone dead, and the hotlines were beginning to ring. While the guns were speaking in Venezuela, another war had broken out at the United Nations in New York. An emergency Security Council meeting was summoned. Russia and China leveled accusations of an illegal invasion against America, declaring, "Today it is Venezuela, tomorrow it will be someone else." The atmosphere was so heated, it felt as though diplomacy was about to devolve into a physical brawl. The world wanted the war to stop, but the veto power had rendered the UN useless. A resolution against America? The US used its veto. A resolution against Venezuela? Russia and China used theirs. The United Nations was reduced to being a mere spectator. The entire system had been completely paralyzed.
Then words turned into threats. A warning arrived from Moscow. Touch our assets and face the consequences. China threatened a global economic blockade. Stock markets crashed instantly. Oil prices began to skyrocket. Europe, already struggling with an energy crisis, was gripped by even deeper fear.
But the ultimate fear wasn't about the economy. It was the fear of World War III. Satellite images revealed a terrifying reality. Russian nuclear forces had been placed on high alert. For the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis, the world was standing at such a dangerous precipice. One small mistake, and the war would spill out of Venezuela and reach the doorsteps of Washington and Moscow.
The world was splintering on the streets too. In European cities, millions were out protesting, shouting one slogan: "No war for oil." Even within NATO, cracks were beginning to show. Amidst this global turmoil, one thing was crystal clear. Venezuela was no longer just a country. It had become a chessboard, a place where superpowers were playing their high-stakes power games. And within this game, a threat was emerging that was even more terrifying than direct warfare.
History is proof. For America, defeating a country is easy, but controlling it is impossible. The global powers realized that a direct confrontation, World War III, would mean mutual destruction. So they activated Plan B, Proxy War. Venezuela had now become the Syria of South America. On one side was the US-backed government, and on the other, insurgents backed by Russia and Iran. While the massive ships and jets might have fallen silent, the danger in the jungles had only intensified. Russia and Iran had quietly funneled advanced weaponry like manpads, shoulder-fired missiles, into the hands of the rebels. Now, no US helicopter was safe. A single, inexpensive missile could bring down an aircraft worth millions of dollars. This was the exact same strategy America once used against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and today, that very strategy was being turned against them.
It wasn't just weapons. Mercenaries were also deployed. Private military companies, men with no flag to follow and no rules to obey. Their job was to bleed US forces dry without triggering a nuclear war. If one of them was captured, Russia or China would simply state, "We have nothing to do with this." This was a shadow war.
The biggest fear of this proxy war was that the fire had begun to spread. The violence was now spilling across borders, bleeding into Colombia and Brazil. Criminal gangs and terrorist organizations were the ones seizing the opportunity. They had gotten their hands on advanced military-grade weapons. US intelligence was receiving reports that some of Venezuela's missiles had already been sold on the black market, posing a direct threat to commercial airliners.
America had imagined a quick victory. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a long, exhausting quagmire, daldal. The enemy wasn't standing in front of them. The enemy was everywhere. The question now was, would America stay and endure an occupation, or would they pull out, leaving behind nothing but a failed state?